Hello and welcome to the Lesson 10 videos, the major bones of the body. So we're going to be continuing on with the skeletal system and really just going through all the major bones that make up you. And it can seem a little intimidating when you're like, oh my gosh, we have so many different bones. But you're going to be surprised at how many you actually already know. All right, so first we're going to get into the axial skeleton and we're going to talk about the skull. So the skull has two sets of bones, and first is the cranium. This is what's going to actually kind of enclose the brain, so we're going to be talking about this part here. And then the facial bones is the second part, and the facial bones are going to be more this area. So your major cranium bones, you have a frontal bone, which is, pretty much your forehead is your frontal bone. And then your parietal bones and your temporal bones, you have two of each of these. That's important to remember. So you have two of each of those. Then you have one occipital bone, a sphenoid bone, and an ethmoid bone. So if I were to tell me all 8 bones of the cranium, you might say, okay, well, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Where's the other 2? Well, you have 2 of each of these, the parietal and then the temporal bone. The temporal bone contains a lot of important, what we call bony markings. One is the external acoustic meatus, and pretty much I just like to call that your ear hole. And then the styloid process is a part where a lot of your neck muscles attach. You also have a zygomatic process and a mastoid process. And process just means it's kind of sticking out of it. So it's usually a lot of times for muscle attachment when you see that word process. So let's take a look at this really quickly. Here's your frontal bone. Remember I said it kind of makes up your forehead. The sphenoid bone is this really hot pink color, and it's kind of hard to see along with the ethmoid bone because they're a little bit more internal. And then here is your temporal bone. So you'll have one on this side and you'll have one on the other side. Here's that external auditory meatus, so the ear hole. And then here is that styloid process and mastoid process. See how they're kind of sticking out like this? This is so you can have muscle attachment. Then you have the parietal bone. So once again, you'll have one on one side and one on the other. And then your occipital bone in the back. So how are these bones held together, these cranium bones? They're held together by something you call a suture. And when you think the word suture, you think like stitches. If you get a cut and you have to go get stitches, we call those sutures. When we talk about sutures as a joint, it's actually kind of like a gluing these two bones together. And there's different ones that you definitely need to know. The sagittal suture goes across here. The coronal suture is right here. The lambdoid suture is right here. And then the lateral suture is right here. And sometimes they have different names, so don't be nervous if you hear this lateral suture called something else. Just make sure that you look it up and you know both names. All right, now we're moving on to the facial bones. So you have a maxilla, or maxillae for plural. That's going to be the upper jaw. The palatine bones are going to be the bones of your hard palate. So if you stick your tongue up on the roof of your mouth right now, you're going to feel that it's really hard. That's your palatine bones. That's making up the hard palate. Zygomatic bones are your cheek bones. The lacrimal bones are going to be what helps kind of form the inner eyes. The nasal bone is going to be the bridge of your nose. The vomer lines the nasal cavity. Your mandible is going to be your lower jaw, and then your nasal concha are going to form the sides of your nasal cavity. So I think the big ones that you need to really make sure that you pay attention to are the nasal bone. Okay, it's going to be right here. The zygomatic bone is going to be your cheekbones. Okay, here's a maxilla and a maxilla. Maxillae for plural, so both of those, your upper jawbone. Here's your mandible, which is the lower jawbone. There is your palatine bones and the lacrimal bones. Those are going to be more internal. And then you have the nasal concha, which once again are going to be kind of more internal. So I really do want you to focus on these ones that are really easy to see, like the zygomatic, the nasal, the maxilla, and the mandible. So next we're going to talk about a really special bone called the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is not part of the skull, but it's really not part of anything else, so that's why we kind of throw it in here with the skull. The hyoid bone is a really unique bone to humankind, and the reason is it allows us to have good language. It allows us to make sounds and articulate that no other species really can. And the thing that's really kind of cool about this hyoid bone is it is not attached to any other bone in the body. It's the only bone that is not attached to another bone. And it's pretty much kind of right below your chin, kind of in that neck area. So we're going to talk a little bit about the fetal skull because I think it's important. And the fetal skull has similarities and differences between the adult skull. So as you can see, we definitely can see some of the same bones. There's a frontal bone, a parietal bone, the occipital bone, temporal bone, and then here's some facial bones. But what you'll notice is these bones don't really have sutures 100% yet. They actually have what we call soft spots, which means that the bones are not totally connected together yet. They're kind of loosely connected, and we call those soft spots. So you've probably heard of infants having soft spots, and that's what we mean by this. Those sutures just aren't 100% solid yet. They're more soft. All right, next we're going to get into the vertebral column, one of the other big parts of the axial skeleton. So your vertebral column is just the spine, and you have 26 irregular bones, including 24 vertebrae. Then you have your coccyx, which is your tailbone, and then your sacrum. And the whole point of this spinal column is to really protect your spinal cord. So let's talk about the different types of vertebrae that you have. So your cervical spine is the top of the spinal column, and it's your first 7 vertebrae. And if you ever look on like a physical therapy notes, or you look at orthopedic notes, you're going to see these right here, these letters. So if they say something is wrong with your C5, they mean it's your 5th cervical vertebrae. So they put the letter here, so C for cervical, and then the number after it, which represents the one that they're talking about. So the top or neck portion of your vertebral column is the cervical spine. Your mid-back is your thoracic spine. It contains 12 vertebrae. And then your low back is considered what we call the lumbar spine, or your lower 5 vertebrae. Underneath the lumbar spine, you have the sacrum, which are 5 actually fused vertebrae. And then you have your coccyx below that, aka your tailbone. Okay, so if we look here, it really breaks it down nice for you. So you can see here's your cervical spine, the top 7, thoracic, the next 12, lumbar, the next 5, then your sacrum, and then your coccyx below it. So make sure you know the order that these are in. Okay, from superior to inferior, and then you know the names and how many vertebrae are in each section. Intervertebral discs. In between each vertebrae, you have what's called an intervertebral disc. And you've probably heard people talk about slipping a disc. That means that part of this intervertebral disc is actually kind of coming out of the vertebrae. And what's important to know here is that really these intervertebral discs are there to kind of shock absorb and also add flexibility. So if you're able to kind of twist your back and forth right now, it's because of these intervertebral discs. And when you're running, you're literally absorbing shock in these intervertebral discs. And as we age, since it is a type of fibrocartilage, there's a lot of water in there. And as we age, water content starts to go down and they become harder and less flexible. So here's an intervertebral disc, and when you get into your higher level anatomy classes in college, it's really cool because you learn about all the different parts to this. So here it is. It sits on top of one of your vertebrae. So see, it's in between two vertebrae. And when someone slips one of these discs, it actually starts to kind of come out. It doesn't sit perfectly like that. But mostly fibrous connective tissue, this outer portion, and then that middle portion here is almost like a jelly-like fluid. Okay, this is what a typical vertebrae kind of looks like. This is a thoracic vertebrae, I believe. So what's important to know on these kind of bony markings? One, the body. This is where your intervertebral disc is going to sit on. It's also really important to know the spinous process and these transverse processes. You have one on each side. This is where a lot of muscle attachment is going to happen. That's why it's important to know. And then the other one is a vertebral foramen. Foramen means hole. And I want you to think a second, what would be going through that hole in this vertebrae right here? Think about it. This is going to be your spinal cord. So your spinal cord is going to go through this hole right here. Okay, so now we're going to get into kind of the special characteristics of each type of vertebrae. So the cervical vertebrae, it's important to understand that your first and second cervical vertebrae have special names, and it's called the atlas and the axis. And this is a picture of them over here. They're very unique in structure because they kind of create this weird joint when they come together that really allows the top of your neck to have ultimate rotation. So it's really, really important for C1 and C2, the atlas and the axis, to fit like this so you can really rotate your neck around. And a lot of people have trouble remembering what comes first, the atlas or the axis. Well, a good way to remember it is the atlas is first and the axis is second. T in the alphabet comes before X. So that's a good way. They don't have very big spinous processes. You don't have a lot of muscle attachment here, and they're the smallest and lightest vertebrae. Okay, then we have our thoracic vertebrae. These are going to be below the cervical spine. They articulate with the ribs. What do I mean by this? It means that they're actually attached to the ribs. So your ribs are going to be attached to thoracic vertebrae. Okay, that's articulations right here. They have a really long spinous process. They have lots of muscle attachment, and they have the same transverse process, spinous process, and then here's your foramen here. But really it's important to know that they articulate with the ribs and have that really large spinous process. Okay, then your lumbar vertebrae. They have massive block-like bodies because they're receiving the most stress, okay, when you're walking, running, doing anything. So they're going to have large intervertebral discs and large, massive bodies. And I always thought when you looked at one of these, it kind of looks like a moose head. Oops, there's your moose mouth right there, and there's his antlers. Okay, the sacrum, below the lumbar spine. It's going to be 5 fused vertebrae, so you actually do have an S1 to an S5. And this is where your pelvic bones attach to the axial skeleton. So here's your pelvic bones, and they attach to the sacrum, forming what we call the SI joint, the sacroiliac joint. So it's where the iliac of your spine is meeting the sacrum. Okay, and then last but not least on our vertebral column is the coccyx. It is kind of a remnant of our ancestors. It's our tailbone. It used to be a tail. We don't have them anymore, and everybody's a little different. You can have 3 to 5 of these fused vertebrae just depending on your genealogy. All right, so we're going to stop here for video 1. Then we're going to continue on and talk about the thoracic cage and get into our lower limbs and our arms. So thanks for watching.